Human trafficking results in the exploitation of those who have become victims to the smugglers. With no stereotypical identification, victims come from all manners of life, race, country, age, and sex. From the poorest countries in the world to the richest, nobody is exempt from the perils of trafficking, with the exploitation of people happening closer to us than we care to think.
Miami-Dade is #1 in Florida for human trafficking, and Florida is #3 in the country. And as I said before, trafficking in the US is a $32 billion industry. So Miami-Dade, unfortunately, is one of the leading counties in our country for trafficking.
Many people are forced into trafficking for a variety of reasons, be it poverty or hunger, fleeing perhaps war, or due to exploitation. But many victims of trafficking admit that they do not want to be in the positions that they find themselves in.
I was unfortunate to be here. Understand? But deserve no. I've never done something that, I never done something bad that that I deserve to be in prison. Understand? It was beyond my will. I cannot do anything. I don't want to lose my life. I want to live.
Hello, welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavatahwe. In this week's show, we will look at one of the largest illegal industries in the world, namely human trafficking, and examine how this $150 billion a year industry rips a significant divide between the rich and the poor, and reminds us of times many agree should have been buried in the past. Just over 5 people out of every 1,000 in the world are victims to modern slavery. Estimates suggest that there are currently over 40 million people around the world stuck in a situation they can rarely free themselves from, and all to feed the human trafficking network. Assessing the full scope of human trafficking is almost impossible to judge, as so many cases around the world go undetected or unreported, hence closing the door on the many silent victims that we do not know about. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, along with the European Union, has launched a global action against trafficking and the smuggling of migrants, a 4-year program with 11 million euros investment aimed at preventing the trafficking of persons. Along with the initiative, 2 portals were also created by the UN. It allowed people to gain information about how to spot signs of trafficking and also a chance to report their findings online, allowing real-time intelligence to be shared with relevant agencies. Only recently, the UK saw a disaster hit. That happened when a lorry was traveling in the high seas. It was traveling from Europe, and it saw the deaths of 39 Vietnamese victims. They all fell prey to freezing conditions in the trailer. That opened the case that more needs to be done to protect victims and report trafficking before tragedy strikes.
Human trafficking, one of the most profitable illegal businesses in the world, and combined with modern-day slavery, affects millions of men, women and children across the globe, of all ages, taking advantage of some of the most vulnerable people to feed the greedy needs of the rich. The United Nations has defined human trafficking as an act of recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion. Broken down into simpler terms, it means movement or recruitment by deception or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. Many associated trafficking from the days of slavery, when rich white landowners exploited Africans and sent them to work on the plantations of the Americas, treating them as slaves and nothing more than commodities. Today, the game has changed, but the exploitation and abuse of victims remains the same. Many people in the modern era are falling foul to human trafficking, forced labour and slavery, not due to the demands of the rich plantation owners, but due to poverty, with many people being forced into making these choices. In a world where the freedom of movement is easier than ever, it's why people want to move that makes the traffickers very rich indeed.
It's not the freedom to move is challenged, it's the freedom to move with documentation, to be able to have rights in the process of migration, as opposed to avoiding the authorities, seeking some other means of travel, which of course then puts you into the hands of people like the brokers and the traffickers who would say, I can get you there, I can get you a job, I can find you a husband, but there's going to be a cost.
The one thing that has changed since the old times is that there's no longer a defined stereotypical person that can become a victim to trafficking and forced labour, nor are there any particular countries immune to the trade, both rich and poor.
It's uncommon, but our report reveals the grim reality. There are 25 million adults and children suffering from labor and sex trafficking all over the world, including in the United States.
Human trafficking is not a victimless crime. Taking a look at some of the figures, 40.3 million people are victims of trafficking and forced labor globally, with 70% of the victims being women and girls. Now, 1 out of every 4 victims is a child under the age of 18. Of the 29.4 million victims of forced labor, 16 million people are exploited in the private sector, be this domestic work, construction, or in the agricultural business. Equally shocking is the fact that 4 million victims are under state authority control, meaning some governments are also exploiting the poor. Now, of the estimated $150 billion made yearly from human trafficking, around $99 billion of this money comes from sexual exploitation, with 99% of the victims in the sex industry being female. Now, $150 billion, well, that's enough to buy several global stock markets outright. With such a large-scale operation, you would think that it would be easy for law enforcement agencies to catch the perpetrators of these crimes. Right? Wrong. Estimates show that only 15,000 people globally have been prosecuted for human trafficking, which, when placed in context, is only 0.03% compared to the number of victims that they create.
There's an obvious economic divide between the rich and poor when it comes to trafficking. The fact there's an estimated 40 million people worldwide in forced labour suggests that the core of the problem is not the victims of the offence, but those who require the end product. Traffickers are essentially the middlemen for the rich, who wish to exploit cheap labour in order to boost their profits at the expense of those willing to put themselves through tough times, and essentially imprison themselves in a life that they can rarely escape from.
Well, when thinking about the causes of forced labour, many often imagine a binary construction of victims of passive agents and perpetrators as unscrupulous employers. Yet causes of forced labour are complex and contextual and also rooted in political economies. So we therefore need to think more both about power relations and also structural conditions that generate severe exploitation.
One of the major problems for the victims of trafficking is the notion of debt bonding. With many people in the world fleeing from hunger, poverty, or lack of opportunity, vast sums of money are being paid to the traffickers in order to facilitate their movement. This, however, leads to serious debt, which is then exploited by the traffickers when the victim arrives at a new destination and are forced into jobs of varying natures and are made to pay back the debts with coercive threats made from the middlemen.
Well, again, it's useful to think about different scales here when trying to understand coercive control. When thinking at the more micro scale of the individual and the employer, we can think about a clustering of different vulnerabilities. So this might mean previous experiences of exploitation or poverty or conflict again that can make it more likely that somebody can gain control over an individual.
The arrival of migrants and cheap labour are not without their consequences of the hosting country, with many European states, for example, resenting the movement of people and beginning to lean towards right-wing ideologies.
Environments of hostility to new arrivals that we're seeing increasingly around the world and deregulated labour markets can really conspire to coerce individuals into situations of extreme exploitation and forced labour.
Time to bring in Mahan Abedin. He's our current affairs and impact analyst in order to find out his take about some of the current events around the world. Mahan, welcome. So let's talk about Brexit. Obviously, it's a big win for Boris Johnson, but is it a good thing for the UK, or is it too early to tell?
Well, I think whether it's good or not depends where you stand politically, ideologically in the UK. But the big issue here, as you said, Boris Johnson has this big majority and he feels as though he can rifle through the negotiations, get a deal with the Europeans by the 31st of December. Remember, the UK may have left the EU, but it will only leave properly once it has a deal, and it needs one by the end of the year. Otherwise, it leaves without a deal, and there could be all sorts of problems.
Boris Johnson wants to make his point that it's going to be successful. So does the EU, but
yes.
Their motives are different, right?
Yes. Well, the EU, first of all, they want this to be a deterrent as well. They don't want other states to leave. They don't want to incentivize others to leave, and hence they need to be seen to be tough with the UK during the negotiations. And just today, Donald Tusk said that the EU might welcome Scotland to the fold. So they're putting real pressure on Boris Johnson's government to play well, to play fairly, in order to get a deal that perhaps meets both sides' need.
That's for sure. Yeah, the indications are as such. Okay, let's move on to the next topic here. Well, many names to it. They call it the shame of the century, slap of the century, and people are actually saying you shouldn't even say it's this so-called peace deal. Well, what is the economic impact that this may have on Palestinian lives, or do you see that it's not what it has been touted to be?
Well, I'm not a great fan of the Palestinian Authority, but the Foreign Ministry of the Palestinian Authority today kind of absolved itself by saying this is a plot of the century. I really like that, because that's, I think it captures its essence quite well. Look, this is a non-starter. This is not a deal.
$50 billion, they say.
Yeah, well,
it was $69 billion at the economic workshop in Bahrain.
Yeah, I think the problem with this is the vision of this so-called deal. If it endures, it could really, harm the Palestinians. But I honestly feel that the Palestinian Authority, which has performed so weakly in the past, this time round, they're going to stand their ground, and perhaps we could see a Palestinian unity, the people in Gaza, Hamas, and the people in the West Bank coming together and to resist this.
Okay, next we have a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the world, like the coronavirus that's really affecting the global economy. Also the assassination of Iranian Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani. This kind of sets the trend for the rest of the year, perhaps, not to mention the China-US trade deal.
Or perhaps not. I mean, difficult to make a prediction, but yeah, it's been a very choppy January. It's been a very difficult January. I think, the indicators are all leading towards instability. The coronavirus thing is beginning to have a huge impact, especially as they're isolating China, and also is playing into these geopolitical fault lines. I mean, some American politicians welcoming coronavirus because it weakens China.
Well, is it true? Wilbur Ross said that, the Commerce Secretary.
Yeah, sure.
Is that going to benefit the states?
Well,
maybe in the short term, right?
It shows their myopic worldview that what hurts my competitor is good for me. So that's the I don't share that view, but obviously some in America do.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure having you and your
welcome.
input, Mohan Abedin there. Okay, time for a quick break. Coming up, we will look at what measures are being taken to stop human trafficking and how those involved are risking their lives to move from country to another as they cross war zones, seas, and borders. Also a look at how victims are quickly entrapped into roles that see them exploited into jobs and positions that leave them even more vulnerable and desperate than they may have been before. Also, a look at the different forms of exploitation, and we will hear from some of the victims of human trafficking. So stay right where you are. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavitahwa. Joining me in the studio today is Jerome Hughes. He's our EU correspondent from Press TV. Now, Jerome has recently attended several conferences in Brussels. He studied the impact of human trafficking in the European Union, a location it seems many victims end up working. Now, Jerome, the EU along with the UN highly condemn human trafficking. Yet, in the very heart of the EU, Brussels, we see rampant human trafficking and forced labor in the sex industry as red light areas spread from Brussels to Amsterdam and beyond. How serious then are the EU in combating this awful practice?
Well, Kaveh, a simple answer to that is that they are turning a blind eye. This is literally happening on their doorstep. If you go to the North train station here in Brussels, you see a string of roads, and inside those roads you have the windows with the women standing there. Outside you have the men who are controlling those women, and they are selling drugs, and they are making huge profits from this, and it's happening outside in public view. I mean, people are traveling because you have the Schengen area, which is the open borders area, and you have very cheap bus services and so on, you have people travelling from around the European Union into places like Brussels and to Amsterdam and places like that, so that they can actually partake in this type of activity. So the European Union is being very hypocritical. We hear all about human rights violations in other countries, but actually on their own doorstep, they're turning a blind eye.
Jerome, the conferences that you attended have been designed to tackle human trafficking in the EU. If you can tell us what has been discussed and what steps have been promised to be taken.
Well, Cava, of course, the European Union, Brussels here, they have some of the main think tanks like the European Policy Centre, Bruegel, the Centre for European Policy Studies and so on. And because of my work for Press TV, and especially because Press TV covers all of these issues very comprehensively in terms of refugees and so on, I've been asked to chair a lot of the debates, especially around the refugee area. And so you have experts on my right, you have experts on my left and so on, and they're all saying the same thing, more or less, is that the EU's asylum policy is broken. And that again feeds the situation for traffickers, because if you close the borders, that actually makes it more lucrative for the traffickers. If you have open routes, if you have safe routes for refugees, that would get rid of that problem. But because you close the borders off, you have Viktor Orban in Hungary and so on. He's one of the main characters involved in this. When you have closed borders, it feeds what the traffickers want, and that is more money, bring more people here illegally and so on without the safe routes. And so all of the experts that I've been dealing with, they say the European Union asylum policy needs to be changed, reformed dramatically.
Okay, thanks. Jerome Hughes there from Brussels. Many thanks for joining me today. Now, many states are acting as best as they can in order to combat human trafficking and modern-day slavery, with policies and promises being made. Yet, how are states acting on them, and are states themselves to blame for what is happening?
So what is being done to stop the flow of trafficking? The simple truth is not enough. Trump's so-called southern border wall with Mexico will have little effect on the migrants headed north to the United States, as the traffickers will always, like most criminals, be one step ahead of the police.
If we build a proper barrier with great technology too, we will see crime throughout the United States go down in percentages that we've never seen before. It'll be an amazing thing, because so much of it comes through the southern border.
The US have also made the notion of human trafficking an alleged top priority in their foreign policy. However, when Ivanka Trump spoke about the plans that they had made, there appeared to be no urgency in the implementation of the policy.
Ending human trafficking is a major foreign policy priority for the Trump administration. Over the past several months, the White House has hosted roundtables and listening sessions with victims, with NGOs, members of Congress, and others to determine steps we can take to better execute a strategy to finally end human trafficking.
On a more international scale, the International Organization for Migration has also addressed the issue in Africa, which has one of the highest rates of people trafficking and migration in the world, with many of the migrants involved aiming for the shores of Europe. This is posing a huge threat to human life as they cross the seas in boats organized by the smugglers, often ending in disaster.
Right now, the majority of the flux we are seeing are definitely Eastern African countries, nationality, and Syrians arriving in Europe. And the latest figures of arrival as of end of September is more or less 140,000 people have arrived.
It can be argued, however, that the nation-states opposed to human migration are in fact one of the main reasons that trafficking has become such a big problem. With states now acting as modern-day abolitionists, very few legal and safe routes are now available for migration, hence making trafficking a prime route into fortress states. The victimization of trafficked people comes once they arrive in the new states, with many forced into low-skilled manual jobs, servitude, or worse, with sexual exploitation seeing around 98% of its victims being vulnerable females. For those unwilling to comply, the choices on the table were never an option.
They put gun on my head, and I just think I have to save my life. Maybe I got kidnapped. I didn't know exactly. What I need to do is life survive.
Exploitation comes in many forms. The estimated annual earnings from trafficking is in the region of $150 billion per year, with almost 2/3 of that money coming from sexual exploitation. With the highest rate of trafficking in this field, the way in which victims are treated are truly horrifying. Labour exploitation sees the rich making the most of cheap labour as they boost their profits, whilst domestic servitude sees exploitation of the workers by restricting movement, forcing long hours of work, with little pay, and in some cases, physical and sexual abuse. Many people are also trafficked and forced into marriage. Yet again, people are promised the idea of a better life, yet placed under emotional and psychological distress, as well as being raped and forced to have children.
It was torture. It was torture because I was getting raped all the time. I was made to have a child. They wouldn't let me go back home without having a child.
Others are being forced into a life of criminality, with gangs operating in the main cities involved in pickpocketing, begging, and theft. In many places in the world, the trafficking of young and vulnerable children is also a common practice, with many in poorer nations being forced into the role of child soldiers. In certain states, figures in the region of 10,000 children have been exploited in this way, with a quarter of them being girls. Organ trafficking is also an illegal trade in which people are trafficked for their organs. Kidneys, livers, and other parts are promised at high prices but rarely paid, leaving the victim in potentially life-threatening situations.
Human trafficking is a dirty business, fueled by the greed of the rich, eyeing opportunities to satisfy their needs, be it through the use of cheap disposal labor to the sexual exploitation of vulnerable sex workers. Many of the root causes of trafficking and forced labor can be stopped through a fair distribution of wealth, access to education, and equality in society. However, when demand for services are so high, well, the supply appears to be readily available, provided by illegal means, and leaving no thoughts to the victims and their families who are left behind. Now, means of help are available, but the sad truth is that the victims of human trafficking are often left voiceless and completely unseen by society. If you would like to share a story with us, or you wish to comment on the show, or get in touch about anything else, our contact details are on the screen now. We would love to hear from you. Don't forget, you can watch the show anytime and anywhere by logging onto our website and clicking on Economic Divide. I've been Kavitaq Vai, and on behalf of the whole team here, thanks for watching, and see you again next time.